Imagine Scandinavia, December, frost, darkness, not just night, but a polar night that lasts for weeks, wind from the fjord, and in the middle of all this, a long wooden house from which a thin stream of smoke escapes. Inside, it is cramped, very cramped. Men, women, children. Somewhere in the corner, cows stomp. It smells of smoke, wet wool, and people. No one has their own room. No one has their own bed. No one sleeps alone. And this is not from poverty. This is a system of survival tested by generations, in which the body of a neighbor was as important a resource as dry firewood or a supply of meat. Today, we break down how the Vikings slept, what the sagas say, what archaeologists have found, and why the very concept of personal space for a Norse warrior of 9th to 11th century would have sounded completely absurd. If you are interested in such stories, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes, and we begin our journey behind the scenes of history. Before talking about sleep, we need to understand what the Vikings were protecting themselves from. Scandinavia of the Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066, was not a single climatic region. The coast of Norway, with its fjords, was moderated by the Gulf Stream, but in inland areas, in Iceland, in Greenland, the conditions were harsh. Researchers from Columbia University, who studied core samples of lake sediments in the Lofoten Islands, an archipelago in Norway above the Arctic Circle, found that climatic conditions in the region were, in their words, on the edge of survival, where even small weather changes had noticeable consequences. A scientific study published in Science Direct in 2022, based on the analysis of lake sediments in southeastern Norway, showed that the period between 300 and 800 CE, the so-called Late Antique Little Ice Age, was significantly colder than the subsequent medieval warm period from 800 to 1300. It was during this cold transitional time that the culture we now call Viking was forming. Polar night, frost, wind, minimal time for harvesting fodder. This is what these people lived in during winter, and this is what they had to protect themselves from. The main winter dwelling of the Vikings was the Longhouse, or Longhouse, from the Old Norse Longhouse. The National Museum of Denmark in Herstwed, one of the leading research organizations studying Viking life, describe it as follows. Length, from 15 to 75 meters. Width, from 5 to 7 meters, depending on the owner's wealth. The largest known longhouse to date was discovered in Borg in Norway on the Lofoten Islands, 272 feet long, that is about 83 meters. The walls, made of wood, turf, or woven wattle coated with clay, depending on the region. In Iceland, where there were almost no trees, the walls were built entirely from turf, and they provided excellent insulation. In colder regions, researchers found traces of double walls with an insulating layer between them. The roof, made of straw or turf, with no chimney at all. Smoke escaped through a special opening in the roof above the hearth. There were no windows at all, or they were tiny, covered with thin membranes made from animal stomachs or with mica. In the center of the house, along its entire length, an open stone hearth. It provided heat, light, and was used for cooking. Along the walls, wooden sleeping benches, wider than simple seats, and they served simultaneously as workspaces, seats, and sleeping places. It was here, on these benches, that the whole family slept, in one shared space. One end of the longhouse, if there were no separate buildings for livestock, was used as a byre. In winter, cows, sheep, and goats stood just behind a low partition from the people. This is not a detail for a nice phrase. This is a key element of the heating system. The Lofoten Viking Museum in Norway and numerous scientific publications on Viking archaeology confirm livestock kept in the same house with people produced a significant amount of heat. A few cows, that is 2,000 to 3,000 watts of living heat continuously, around the clock, without firewood. Researchers from Harvard, who studied Viking settlements in Greenland, established in the coldest years before their decline, the Norse, according to archaeological evidence, began keeping animals in even closer proximity to people,
in order to survive. The Vatsdila saga describes a family that relied on the heat of their livestock to endure a particularly harsh winter. The floor was covered with straw, furs, or woven mats to reduce heat loss to the cold ground. Windows, if they existed, were minimal. Doors, strategically positioned to avoid direct flows of cold wind. This was not untidiness or lack of choice. This was deliberate and effective thermodynamic architecture that the Vikings refined over generations.
Now directly to sleep. And here there are very specific data from primary sources. The research portal Project Forlog, which specializes in early medieval Scandinavia, compiled data from sagas and formulated the following. In early medieval Scandinavia, people slept naked or in linen underwear. This is confirmed by several sagas. For example, Gisla Saga. The main character tries to sneak into a dark longhouse at night unnoticed, and the absence of trousers was supposed to make it harder to identify the attacker by touch in the dark. Herstwick, a research center focused on experimental archaeology of the Viking Age, cites another illustrative passage from Grettis Saga. In the morning, the host's daughter and a servant were the first to wake up and saw Grettir, the hero, naked, sleeping. Most inhabitants of the Longhouse slept, depending on circumstances, directly on the floor near the fire, on a wooden bench platform, or in the loft, but not in separate rooms. What did they sleep on? Herstwick and Project Forlog confirm the standard was a straw mattress. Moreover, in the Oseberg burial mound in Norway, dated to around 850, 31 kilograms of goose and swan down and other feathers were found, placed inside a fabric casin. That is, the wealthiest could afford down bedding, but this was a privilege of the elite. Enclosed sleeping rooms, lokrekja, locked bed, are mentioned in the sagas, but as an exception for the master and mistress of the house. Herstwick states, almost none of the archaeologically discovered dwellings had separate rooms for couples or individuals. The rest slept together in a shared space.
And now, a detail that most surprises modern people. On long sea voyages, the Vikings took with them a gudfat, hudfat, literally skin bag. It was a large hide sewn along the sides. Icelandic sources, including Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, and materials from the Viking Ship Museum in Denmark describe this item clearly. The gudfat was designed for 2 people. 2 men climbed into one skin bag and slept like that. The reason is simple and entirely practical: body heat. 2 bodies in an enclosed space made of impermeable skin, often sealskin because it is waterproof, retains significantly more heat than one. On the ship, there were no sleeping places. The space between the rowing benches, that is where they slept if they did not go ashore. Often on land, they stretched a sail over the ship like a tent or set up woolen tents. The gudfat is one of the most well-documented artifacts of Viking everyday life at sea, and it clearly illustrates the general principle: sleeping alone in the cold is a waste of heat and a danger.
It is important to understand, sleeping together was nothing unusual for that era at all, not only among the Vikings. The researcher Project Forlog writes directly, in the early Middle Ages, even noble lords had their favored servants who slept beside their bed. Strangers shared beds in inns. This caused nothing unusual. Sleeping in one's own room, in one's own bed, is a modern luxury that emerged much later. For the Vikings and their contemporaries, this practice had several completely rational reasons. First, heat. Bodies produce heat. The more bodies together, the warmer it is. In conditions of frost and limited firewood, this had direct importance for survival. Second, safety. Sleeping next to several people meant that there was someone who would hear an unusual sound. Young men and servants slept closer to the entrance. They were the first to respond. Third, material economy. One large bench or one large straw mattress is easier to make than 10 separate ones. There were enough hides and wool blankets for everyone if they lay together. Gisla Saga, Egil Saga, Grettis Saga. In all of these texts, shared sleeping is mentioned as something completely ordinary, without any comment or explanation.
To fully understand the system of heat retention, we need to talk about clothing. because clothing is not only what was worn during the day, it is also what people slept under. Archaeological finds from the Oserberg and Gokstad burials in Norway, as well as from the trading center of Birka in Sweden, confirm the main material of the Vikings was wool. The fabric, which in Old Norse was called vadmal, homespun woolen cloth, was used literally for everything, from everyday clothing to a standard unit of account in Iceland. Taxes were paid with it. Why wool? It retains heat even when wet. This is critically important in the Scandinavian climate with its constant moisture. Over a linen undergarment, a wool tunic. Over it, a wool or fur cloak. Herstwick describes how women would sew in the sleeves of the tunic for work each day and unpick them at night. Footwear, leather shoes made using the turn shoe method, turned inside out so that the seam would not chafe. Socks, woolen, made with the nulla-binding technique, which produces a dense, warm material. In Archaeology magazine in 2021, finds from a female burial in central Norway from the 9th–10th century are described. 6 pieces of wool and 2 pieces of linen in several layers, traces of the clothing in which the woman was buried. All of this clothing was not fully removed at night. Sleeping in the base layer, covered with a cloak over a blanket, this was the standard nighttime scenario for most people.
Winter for the Vikings was not only about survival, it was also an entire cultural season. The most important event of the winter calendar was Yule, Jol in Old Norse. It was a multi-day ritual celebration that took place in midwinter. The most detailed description of it is contained in the Saga of Hakon the Good, part of Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, based on earlier sources. It describes Yule lasted 3 nights, beginning with the midwinter night, and was a time of sacrifices, communal drinking of ritual ale, and vows. The first toast to Odin, the second to Njord and Freyr for peace and harvest, then toasts in honor of ancestors and leaders. It was during Yule that the community gathered most closely together. Although the main celebrations took place in larger halls or near temples, the core principle remained the same: closeness, community, heat from the hearth, and from the bodies of people nearby. Britannica notes, since by late autumn most livestock that could not be fed through winter had to be slaughtered, during Yule there was relatively abundant meat and food for the feasts. Celebrations were lively, and this too was part of the survival strategy in the darkness: psychological support of the community through ritual and shared meals.
Another documented aspect of Viking sleep that few people know about. The sagas mention the concept of first sleep. That is, people naturally woke up in the middle of the night and then fell asleep again. This is the so-called biphasic or segmented sleep model. For example, in Grettis saga, the hero gets up after the first sleep to attend to matters, then lies down again. Sleep researchers have established that this kind of pattern was not an exception, but the norm for people before the era of artificial lighting. It was also described in medieval England and among other pre-industrial societies. For the Vikings, this had practical significance. The night was not a completely passive time. Adding firewood to the hearth, checking on the animals, taking turns maintaining the fire, these tasks were carried out during this waking interval between sleeps. Shared living meant there was always someone to keep watch and someone to tend the fire.
So let's summarize. Vikings did not sleep alone, and this was neither coercion nor primitiveness. It was a rational, tested system of thermal and social survival, confirmed by material and written sources. The body of a neighbor is a source of heat. A shared bench is material economy. A common space is safety. Animals nearby are 3,000 watts without firewood. A 2-person hoodfat is survival at sea. And here an unexpected contrast appears: a private bedroom, a separate bed, personal space. We perceive this as a sign of civilization, as a natural state of things, but from the perspective of most of human history, this is an anomaly, a product of the Industrial Revolution, central heating, and mass furniture production. The Vikings did not have central heating, and did not need it. They had community. Roughly speaking, their heating system was each other. Moreover, there is some evidence that sleeping next to people you trust psychologically provides deeper and calmer sleep. This is natural for humans as social animals.
Next time you feel that your apartment is cold and lonely, remember, 1,200 years ago, the solution to this problem was simple. You lie down in a longhouse with a dozen people. A cow breathes behind the wall. A fire burns in the center of the room. And most likely, all this time you know for sure, you are not alone.